me ask you a question. What is the key to relationships? I think if I were going to answer that from a biblical point of view, I'd say the answer is relatively simple. The Bible would say that we learn to love one another. Jesus said the greatest commandment is that we love the Lord, and the second is that we love each other. On top of that, later he said, a new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another as I have loved you. He upped the standard from the Old Testament, love your neighbor as yourself. Now we're to love others as he loved us and gave himself for us. That's an entirely different standard for love. And if all of that isn't enough, on top of all of that, he said, you should even love your enemies. So clearly, Jesus taught that we are to love one another. If I were going to scratch around in the scriptures to find another key to relationships, I think I would land on the word patience. If there's anything a relationship needs, it is patience. As a matter of fact, that is considered one of the characteristics of love. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, Paul lists some of the descriptive phrases of love, many of which are negative, two of which are positive, and one is that we be patient, in the old translation, long-suffering, and kind to one another. Those are the two outstanding positive things in that passage. Now, is there anything else we could say? Is there any other biblical key to relationships? And I would like to suggest there is another that goes perhaps beyond what I've mentioned, or is at least an extension beyond it. And it's found in 1 Peter chapter 3. Now, I'm going to read that passage in a second, but before I do, let me remind you that as we've been going through the book of 1 Peter, we have seen Peter talk about one relationship after another. As a matter of fact, this whole section of 1 Peter could be called the manual on relationships. He starts by talking about our relationship to God the Father. That's back in chapter 1, verses 13 through 21. Then he talks about our relationship with other believers, beginning in chapter 1, verse 22, and going all the way through chapter 2, verse 10. Then he talks about our relationship to the world in general, specifically to our relationship to government. He talks about the relationship of servants to their masters and the relationship between husbands and wives. So this whole section of 1 Peter is talking about relationships. As a matter of fact, I think I would say that this book, in a great degree, is about relationships. And I don't mean just 1 Peter. I am of the opinion, having done reading in this area for decades, that the finest book on relationships ever printed is the Bible itself. This is a book about relationships. Now, if you look at these passages in 1 Peter, you will see that he constantly talks about two concepts. Love is repeated, and so is the concept of submission. That's repeated in the section I just referred to. On top of all of that, instead of speaking to a specific group like servants or married people, he then talks to everybody and gives another key to relationships. I'm going to call this the ultimate in relationships. If you want to have what the Bible would say is the ultimate in a relationship with somebody else, this is what you have to do regardless of what they do. With that in mind, look at 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 8. Finally, all of you be of one mind, having compassion for one another. Love as brethren. Be tender-hearted. Be courteous. not returning evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, blessing, knowing that you were called to this, that you may inherit a blessing. For he who loves life," and now he's beginning to quote Psalm 34, "and sees good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and the ears of the Lord are open to their prayers. But the face of the Lord are against those who do evil." Now, there's a lot in this passage, and I'm going to try and unpack it in a minute. But before I do that, I want to suggest that there's one word that summarizes everything in this paragraph. More than one Bible teacher has discussed this and says that the key to all of this is a word in verse 9. He says, "But on the contrary, blessing." In short, he is saying, be a blessing to other people. That is the sum of everything that's in this paragraph. Or to say that same thing another way, what is in this paragraph, one form or another, is a form of just being a blessing. Go benefit somebody else. Now, what does that look like? Well, let's look at this passage. He has been dealing with public and, let's say, professional relationships, even things in your private life. Now he discusses things in general. And he says, be of one mind. Now that obviously is a reference to unity, but I quickly need to add that unity is not uniformity. Unity isn't saying that we all have the same opinion about everything. I'm going to really crawl out on a limb for a minute. This will probably get me in trouble, but let me suggest that we don't all have the same political opinions. True? As a matter of fact, among the 12 disciples, they didn't all have the same political opinion. One was described as a zealot. His whole idea was that we should eliminate Rome from the land of Palestine. Matthew was a tax collector who cooperated with Rome. Now that's another way of saying that among the disciples, there was somebody on the extreme right and there was somebody on the extreme left. That's right. And they were all members of the apostles, no less. So what does it mean to be of the same mind? Do we have to agree on everything? No. But being of the same mind, spiritually, means that we have the same thoughts and feelings about a particular issue. Or as one has said it, we have common interest. Or to say it biblically, we all have the mind of Christ. We are unified in our spiritual purpose, objectives, and goals. We are unified and have the same mind, particularly about the Lord. And by the way, that passage that says have the mind of Christ in Philippians chapter 2 is saying he was a servant. You go be a servant. On that, we can be of one mind. Then he says, having compassion for one another. The Greek word translated compassion is a compound word that comes from the word suffer and the word with. Compassion is suffering with somebody. It is being affected by their feelings. It is being sympathetic. As a matter of fact, the English word sympathetic comes from this Greek word. It denotes sharing the experience of another or suffering together. Compassionate people suffer together with others. They weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. The simple reality is that people are hurting. I think people are hurting more than we are aware. One comedian said, if we were to act the way we really feel, 4 out of 8 people at a dinner table would be sitting there sobbing. Everybody is hurting, and what we need to do is be sympathetic. We need to be compassionate, tender-hearted, which we'll get to in a minute. Now, what prevents us from doing that? Well, I can think of a couple of things. So we're so self-centered, we don't think about the other person. That'll do it. Or, I think, and others have pointed this out, that we are exposed to so much suffering that we're immune to it anymore. It's on the evening news, it's in the paper, it's on the internet, it's on Facebook, it's everywhere. And so we hear so much about people suffering that we aren't as compassionate, I think, as we would be otherwise. Or there's the whole problem of, guys aren't supposed to be emotional, so they aren't supposed to show sympathy. Well, let me just tell you that the ideal is Jesus, and he was compassionate. If you read the Gospels carefully, he healed people for a number of different reasons. One was to confirm who he was, and one was simply because he was compassionate. Matter of fact, one of my stories about this that I like so much has to do with a football player. In August of 1984, after 10 seasons with the Chicago Bears, the place kicker, Bob Thomas, was notified by the Bears management that he was being cut from the team. Thomas, a Christian, waited until he knew the locker room would be cleared of players to clean out his things. He didn't have the emotional strength to face the players he'd grown to love. His celebrated teammate, Walter Payton, another believer, had learned of Thomas's termination and waited alone at the kicker's locker after the others had left. When Bob saw Walter, he buried his face in his running back's chest and allowed his friend and fellow Christian to comfort him. After Walter Payton's death in the fall of 1999, Bob Thomas recalled that emotional moment in the Bears locker room, and he said, quote, "To share your grief with a Hall of Fame running back with that kind of compassion, empathy, and ability to really is really my favorite memory of the guy we call Sweetness." End of quote. Guys should be compassionate. Jesus was, and of all things, the famous running back Hall of Famer Walter Payton was. Well, if that's the case, sir, you can be too. Then he says we're to love as brethren. Boy, that really speaks to me. We're to love each other as brethren because we're all members of the same family. Now, as you well know, I have one brother and no sisters. And my brother and I are very close. I love my brother dearly. We didn't grow up that way. We were 4 years apart, and because he was so much younger, I didn't want him around. But in our adult life, we've become very, very close. So when I read the text that says, I'm to love you like I love my brother, it really speaks to me. Now, the reason I mention my brother is I want to say this. Do you have a sibling that you don't like? This doesn't apply. Do you have a sibling that you really are close to? This applies. So find the sibling or the person that you're relative to, that you're really close to, and love everybody like you love that person. Then he says, be tender-hearted. That only appears twice in all the New Testament. It appears here and in Ephesians 4:32. Outside the New Testament, this word means to be good-hearted, forgiving, affectionate. Here it depicts a warm, tender spirit, an affectionate sensitivity toward other people. It means being affectionately sensitive, quick to feel, quick to show affection. One author put it like this: it denotes a warm and tender attitude. It speaks of rich emotion. In the midst of trial and suffering, it's easy to become self-centered, nursing one's own wounds. One can become callous without ever recognizing it. The Christian may not do so. He will not if he cultivates tenderheartedness. This is done by taking an interest in others and learning to be sensitive to their emotions. When you listen to people, listen to their emotion, which might not necessarily be expressed in words. So let me ask, are you hard-hearted or soft-hearted? Are you cold-hearted or warm-hearted? Part of blessing others is just being tender-hearted, sympathetic, and loving. Then he says, be courteous. Wow. That's a compound word that combines loving and friendly with heart and mind. It means to be friendly, to be kind. It's the Greek word from which we get our English word philanthropy, which is the idea of giving oneself to benefit others, which is the essence of the concept of bless others. Webster defines courteous as politeness combined with kindness. It is not just an outward show of refinement, it's an inner attitude of tender regard for others. We are to be courteous. You know, I think that's probably best expressed in little things. I mean, real little things. Like letting somebody else in traffic. Or holding the door open for a person behind you. Or turning off your cell phone in a restaurant. Boy, that's really meddling, isn't it? In church, it's giving a visitor a hymnal turned to the page they're singing. In the grocery store, it's letting a person with a few items ahead of you when your basket is full. It's doing those little things that are courteous. Could we improve the world if we did that? Just be a blessing. Do something little, like being courteous. A little boy prayed, "Oh Lord, make the bad people good and the good people nice." All right. Put all these things together. We're to be compassionate, brotherly love, tender-hearted, courteous. Let me tell you a story that sort of combines it all. There is a school in Brooklyn, New York, that caters to children with learning disabilities. At a fundraising dinner, the father of one of the children in that school delivered a speech. After extolling the school and its dedicated staff, he said, "Where is the perfection for my son, Shea? Everything God does is done with perfection, but my child cannot understand things as other children do. My child cannot remember facts and figures as other children do. Where is God's perfection?" The audience was shocked at the question. "I believe," the father answered, "that when God brings a child like this into the world, the perfection that he seeks is in the way people react to this child." Then he told a story. One afternoon, Shea walked past a park where some boys he knew were playing baseball. He asked, "Do you think they would let me play?" His father knew most of the boys who would not want him to be part of their team. But he understood that if his son were chosen to play, it would give him a sense of belonging. So he approached one of the boys in the field and asked if his son could play. The boy looked around for guidance from his teammates. Getting none, he said, "We're losing by 6 runs, and the game is in the 8th inning. I guess you can be on our team, and we'll try to put you up for bat in the 9th inning." So little Shia was told to put on a glove and go play center field. In the bottom of the 8th inning, his teammates scored a few runs, but they were still behind by 3. In the bottom of the 9th, his team scored again. With 2 outs and the bases loaded, he was scheduled to bat. Surprisingly, he was given the bat. Everyone knew that it was all but impossible for him to hit because he had never held a bat before. He didn't have an idea about how even to hold it properly, let alone hit with it. He stepped up to the plate. The pitcher moved a few steps and lobbed the ball in softly. The first pitch came in, and he swung clumsily and missed. One of his teammates came up, and together they held the bat and faced the pitcher. The pitcher again took a few steps forward to toss the ball softly. As the pitch came in, Shia and his teammate swung the bat, and together they hit a slow ground ball back to the pitcher. The pitcher picked up the soft grounder and easily could have thrown the ball to first base. Instead, he threw the ball on a high arc to right field, far beyond the catch of the first baseman. Everyone started yelling, "Shia, run! Run to first! Run! Run fast!" Never in his life had Shia run to first. He scrambled down the baseline, wide-eyed and startled. By the time he reached first base, the right fielder had the ball. He could have thrown the ball to second base. Instead, he threw the ball high and far over the third baseman's head. Everyone yelled, "Run to second! Run to second!" Shia ran toward second base as the runners ahead of him circled the base toward home. As he reached second base, the opposing shortstop ran to him, turned him in the right direction toward third base, and shouted, "Run to third!" Shia run to third. As he rounded third, the boys from both teams ran behind him screaming, "Shia, run home!" Shia ran home, and all 18 boys lifted him up on their shoulders and made him the hero, as he had just hit a grand slam and won the game for his team. That day, said the father, softly with tears trickling down his face, those 18 boys reached the level of God's perfection. We need to be compassionate. We need to be tender-hearted. We need to be loving. Now, the objection to all of this is, well, yeah, but what if somebody treats you poorly? Then what do you do? Well, the tendency would be to retaliate, to get back at that person. So Peter goes on to say in verse 9, not returning evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, blessing. This is very important. You see, it might be easy to show all of these characteristics, to be a blessing to a handicapped child. It's a little more difficult when somebody has put you down, when somebody has reviled against you, when somebody has done evil against you, what do you do then? Crawl in the fetal position? Cry? It would be perfectly legitimate to grieve. But what do you do after that? Retaliate? Revile back? Peter says, you are to be a blessing even in the face of evil. That's why I call this the ultimate in relationships. Hear what Peter says. He says, do not revile, not returning evil for evil or reviling for reviling. So when somebody reviles you, you are not to revile back. The Greek word translated revile means abuse or rail. So when somebody rails against you, you ever had that happen? Or when somebody abuses you, Peter says you don't return in kind what they have done. So when he was abused, Jesus did not revile. He did not revile in return. We saw that back in chapter 2, verse 23. And then we're told we should follow in his steps. This has been called the right reaction to insult. Do not retaliate with verbal abuse, vengeance, or violence. Don't treat others the way they treat you. Don't wash off dirt with dirt. Or as someone has said, instead of putting others in their place, put yourself in their place. Or we should respond by blessing them. The believer's response to hostile treatment should be positive, not negative. So he says, do not return evil for evil. Don't pay back, and don't revile even when you are reviled. So the sum is, bless others. Don't blast them. Being reviled, you still bless. Someone has said, to return evil for good is devilish. To return good for good is human. To return good for evil is godlike. Oh, boy, that says it all. That's so good, I'd like seconds. Can I repeat that?
Yes.
All right. To return evil for good. That's devilish. To return good for good, that's human. But to return good for evil, that's godlike. That's godlike. We rebelled against him, and he sent his son to die for it. When he was reviled, going to the cross, he did not revile again. He did not return evil for evil. Warren Wiersbe puts it like this. We live on one of three levels. The satanic level returns evil for good. The human level returns good for good. And the divine level returns good for evil. Al Masters was married, had a little boy, and a small business. He could consider himself very blessed. And then, just before Christmas, his little boy was killed by a 15-year-old kid driving a car without a license. Al Masters was filled with deep desire for revenge. And even though his youngster, 15 years old, could not be brought before the full powers of the law because he was a juvenile, Al Masters wanted the book thrown at him. Then, on Christmas Day, his wife got him to go to church. He recognized that he was one of the world's ungodly and began to weep. The next day, on Christmas, he set out to find out more about the boy who had killed his son. He found out that he came from a broken home, that he lived with his mother, who was an alcoholic, and he went to meet the boy. He gave him a job in his shop and later took him into his home. And that boy, now a young man, said that Al Masters is the most saintly person he has ever known. Now, you say, wow, who does that? Not many, granted. So let's look at the next verse. He says in the latter part of verse 9, knowing that you were called to this, that you may inherit a blessing. If you have trusted Jesus Christ and you are a member of the family of God, you were called to this. Who does that? A child of God, depending on the grace of God. That's who. Granted, this is not human. Humans return good for good. This is supernatural. It comes from the Lord, who gives us the power to bless those who curse us. Remember that? Jesus, Sermon on the Mount. So who does this? The answer is Christians. In the context, he says, knowing this, that you were called to this, meaning being a blessing. And in the context, that includes all the things that I mentioned in verse 8. Unity, compassion, love, tenderness, and courtesy. Wow. Is that a different way to live or what? Let me put it like this. Would that improve your relationships? I mean, even with people who don't treat you fairly or justly, would this improve your relationship with them? Well, let me go one step further. Let me tell you what it will do. It'll improve your relationship with the Lord. I started out saying this is the ultimate in relationships, and I'd like to add, not just with other people, but with the Lord. Matter of fact, he says that in this passage. He says that you may inherit a blessing. Now, that very phrase is used in Colossians 3 of being rewarded at the judgment seat of Christ. That is, if you do what the Lord told you to do, you will inherit a blessing called a reward at the judgment seat of Christ. Now, what he does next in verses 10 and 11 is he quotes Psalm 34. And because he does that, many have suggested that the inheritance might be in this life as well as the next. And that, I think, is a legitimate observation. So, you are to bless others because you were called to this and because you will be blessed by God if you do it. So this not only improves your relationship with other people, it improves your relationship with others. All right. He then quotes Psalm 34. Look at verse 10. For he who would love life and see good days. All right, let me ask you a question. Would you like to see good days? Everybody in favor of that? Here's the formula. Let him refrain his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking guile. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. Now, if you're living with somebody who is, somebody has treated you evil, you say, well, how could I have good days living in this relationship? And the answer is, you can live good days because the Lord is going to bless you if you respond in blessing and not cursing. So, If you love life, to love life suggests enjoying life and being content in the light that God has given you, no matter what the outward circumstances. You can decide to escape life, endure life, or enjoy life. Did you hear what I just said?
Yes.
Let me just tell you, a lot of people escape it through drugs or alcohol or sex or materialism. You can try to escape it. Or you can endure it, grin and bear it. Or by the grace of God, you can enjoy life regardless of your circumstances because you are doing what He told you to do, knowing that He will bless you for it. Amen? Now, if you look at 10 and 11, you will see that there's 3 sets of couplets. Let him refrain his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking guile. Let him, the word let appears 3 times. Turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. So, if you love life, you will see good days. And these are the things you need to do. Do not speak evil or deceive. Evil speaking includes speech that is degrading, impure, slanderous. Guile, that is deceit in this passage, is more subtle form of evil speaking. The kind of evil speaking says something that appears to be true, but it is actually a lie intended to deceive. So don't speak evil. Then he says don't do evil, but do good. Instead of doing evil, the believer is to do good. That is, in this context, they are to bless others. And then don't seek conflict, but pursue peace. Harmony must not only be sought, it must be eagerly pursued. It can be lost, and therefore it should be sought. It can be elusive, therefore it must be pursued. Track it down, and you'll find it. It is impossible as much as depends on you, as much as is possible, as much as lieth within you. Paul says in Romans 12:18, be at peace with all men. Now, one more verse. Verse 12. Why should you do this? For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to the prayers, but the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. The reason is, look, you ought to go bless others because you're called to this as a child of God. You will inherit a blessing if you do it. And oh, by the way, the Lord is watching. Now, this is very interesting. Because when the Lord watches, he sees more than we do. He knows what we need before we ask. A human father often hears before he sees and has to be told the need in order to know. The Lord's eyes see it all before you even do. It has been suggested that the eyes of the Lord are a reference to his protection, and the ears of the Lord are a reference to his provision. Believers are to do righteousness, and as they do, they will have God's protection and provision. They will experience good days. You bless others, and God will bless you with good days. On the other hand, the Lord's face and favor are against those who do evil. So instead of a smile on the Lord's face when he watches what you're doing and thinking, there will be a frown on his face. When the Lord's face is against you, he will not hear your prayers. We found that out in chapter 3, verse 7. So our relationship to others determines the character of our life. Our relationship to others determines the character of our life. If we cultivate a gracious, benevolent spirit toward others, we will inherit a blessing. You'll at least have the blessing of the Lord on your life. So it does not matter what other people do or say. The issue is, are you blessing them? Matter of fact, in Romans chapter 12, Paul talks about this and says, you ought to bless them and pour coals of fire on their head. That's an interesting concept. All right. We've covered a lot of ground today. Did you get it? What's the one word? When you leave here, what's the one word? Go bless somebody. Did you get it? Do I need to repeat it? Go bless somebody. Y'all have heard me say before that I have airborne allergies. And I got some. Have y'all had allergies? You had allergies? Oh, boy. Well, this time it turned into an ear infection. I've never had that happen before. But my ear was killing me. So I went to urgent care yesterday. And the doctor looked in the ear and he said, yep, it's angry. Gave me an antibiotic. And then he said, you ever have wax in your ear? And I said, yeah. Matter of fact, I just had my regular doctor's appointment and they cleaned them out. He said, put a drop of olive oil in your ear. And that'll prevent the wax buildup. I'd never heard that. So we chatted. He's a real friendly guy. We chatted for a while and it was over. And I said, by the way, how often do I do this? And he said, well, I normally tell people every day, but they don't do that. No, he said this. If I tell them Monday, Wednesday, Friday, they forget. So I tell them every day. And I said, doctor, I am a pastor. I understand that. I don't know about olive oil in your ear, but I know about the Word of God in your heart. You need to do this how often? Every day. And what is it you are to do? Music to my ears. We're to bless others. And why are you to do it? That gets a little trickier. That's what you were called to do. The Lord has blessed you by saving you. Go bless somebody else. And as an added incentive, if you do, you'll have a good life. With the Lord, I don't know about that other person. If they're going to do evil, that's their problem. It's the Lord's problem. Give it to the Lord. But you can have a good life in your heart by saying, I'm doing what the Lord wants me to do, and He loves me, even if that jerk doesn't. Amen. Got it? Amen. One more time. One word is to, and you're to do it how often? That's the message. Now, let me suggest two things. Do you know the Bible starts out saying this? Book of Genesis. It's the first book in the Bible. And the seed plot of the Bible, after a long introduction, is Genesis 12. God calls Abraham, and this is what He says to him. I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to make you a great nation. And then He says this, I'm going to bless the whole world through you. Wow. Now, that's a veiled reference to the fact that through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob comes the Messiah. And through the Messiah, He blesses the whole world. But what strikes me is, he was called to be a blessing to the whole world. The Bible starts out that. It's the seed plot of the Bible. We're called to do this. So just go do it. And as a little added incentive, The Lord's watching. Now, you can take that negatively, as most people do when they use it with little kids, or you can take it positively. The Lord's watching, and if He sees you blessing others, He blesses you. So the Lord watching is not all bad. The parents of a small boy in Burma sent him to a mission school so that he could learn to read. As a result, the boy began to lose faith in idols. So the father took him to a temple where the fragrance of incense filled the air. The father showed the boy the glimmering image covered in gold and silver, ornaments surrounded by flowers and candles. Here, said the father, is a God you can see. The Christians cannot show you their God. Yes, said the boy, we can see your God, but He cannot see us. We cannot see the Christian God, but He sees us all the time. So here's the message of the day. Go bless people every day. And remember, the Lord sees you blessing them, and He will bless you. Amen. Father, thank you.